All right, let's talk a little bit about electoral systems. Electoral systems are actually one of my favorite topics in this course because it really highlights how the rules really do matter, and that's independently of the intentions of different political actors, it's independently of culture, independently of other factors. So electoral rules are, and those who emphasize electoral rules are very much on the structuralist side, and it really shows, it's a really case in point on how structuralism has at least something going for it when it comes to talking about variation within democracies. So what's an electoral system? An electoral system is the mechanism by which votes in an election are turned into control over political offices and shares of political power. Said less formally, it's basically how you count the votes. And it turns out that for a given distribution of votes, you can get very different distributions of political power depending on how you count the votes. One of my favorite examples is the United States in 2012, where 49% of the people voted Democrat, and Democrats got 48% of the seats, and then something like 47% of the population voted for Republicans, and Republicans got about 51 or 52% of the seats. What you see is a disproportional result, because at the end of the day, the way elections are organized, the rules about how you count the votes often can matter more, in some cases matter more than what the votes actually are. So arguably, every electoral system is different in some tiny way or other, but generally speaking, we think about systems to the degree that they either help present two competing agendas, right? Two clear competing agendas of what direction the country should go in, or they accurately represent the much more variegated political preferences of the public. So does the electoral system simplify your choices down to two, or does it give you a large menu of choices? And this ultimately reflects different intuitions about what voting in a democracy is supposed to accomplish. You see hints of the majoritarian consensus divide here, but you also see other values at play, such as, for example, are elections the only way in which the people can legitimately or should legitimately be able to influence their government? Right. So, arguably, in majoritarian systems, the argument is that, or particularly in first-past-the-post sorts of majoritarian systems, the view is that there's many ways in which you can make your voice heard, not just via voting. And so, as a result, the function of voting is not to represent the people's political views, or is not the only way to represent the people's political views. Whereas I think in proportional representation type systems, more consensus-oriented systems, the argument is that all legitimate political representation has to go through the electoral system. Okay, so types of electoral system. Well, again, here's a continuum. On the one side, on the left side of the continuum here, you have those systems tend to provide a clear choice between two major parties. These are first-past-the-post systems and alternative vote systems. And on the other side, you have the systems that attempt more or less to accurately represent the political views of the people in all their wonderful diversity, and that those are mixed member proportional system, MMP, and list PR, proportional representation. I'm going to talk about FPTP and AV in this lecture. I'm going to save the stuff on mixed member proportional and list PR for the next one, because otherwise this would get long, and it's long enough as is. Okay, so there are two major types of first-past-the-post systems, sometimes also called winner-take-all. You'll hear the term winner-take-all because the idea is whoever gets the most votes gets to represent everyone in the district. Right? There could be 49% of the people that voted for one party, but if 51% of the people voted for the other party, those 49% of the people get no representation in a certain sense, or they're represented by other people's representatives. And of course, proportional representation is the other major kind of representational system, and which we will talk about in the next lecture. So, within first-past-the-post systems, you have the classic first-past-the-post, which you see in the United Kingdom and the United States. And you have the alternate vote system, which I will talk about in a little bit. So how does first past the post work? Well, if you've been paying attention to politics at all during your life, or if you have taken a course in American national government, you should be very familiar with first past the post, because it is the system that we have in the United States almost universally, all the way down to the local level. What happens is that you divide the country into districts. Now, usually these districts are equally sized, but as you know, for instance, the United States Senate is not equally sized. This is actually quite rare throughout the world, that a chamber of representation is explicitly disproportional, but the United States is one of the examples of that. So usually equally sized, but not always. And once you divide the countries into districts, you hold a vote in each district, and the candidate with the most votes in each district is going to be elected to the legislature. Very simple, right? There are features of first past the post that are important to note. One important feature is this question of how the districts are drawn up. Right? Depending on how you cut up the districts, you can influence the results. This is called gerrymandering, when you change the districts in order to secure political advantage of some sort. But even the districts have to be changed regularly, regardless, because populations move or grow at different rates. And when that happens, you can districts that were previously equally sized are no longer equally sized, and even if they're equally sized, they might be very different demographically in some way. In the United Kingdom, where first past the post essentially originates, which we inherited their electoral institutions in some ways, in the UK, you had this phenomena in the 1800s called the rotten boroughs. The rotten boroughs were basically districts where everybody left. And they were countryside, rural districts usually, and everybody left for the cities to find jobs. But there was no laws mandating changes in electoral districts, and so you had these districts with 20 people in them, and other districts with hundreds of thousands of people in them, and each got one vote. And of course, a lot of people thought that was massively unfair, and so eventually in the mid-1800s, this system was changed, and what it did was it eventually broke the hold of the rural aristocracy over English democracy. But that's a story for another day. The point is that in the United States, at least, we have a regular census, which tells us which districts are growing and which districts are shrinking, and based on that, Congress is constitutionally mandated to reapportion the districts. But of course, that is a political process, and I've got other videos on that, so I'm not going to talk about it too much more. One important feature of first past the post systems, and why it's so influential at the end of the day on the political system as a whole, is that first past the post systems will tend to produce two major parties and eliminate the influence of smaller parties. So the electoral system has a strong influence on what we call the party system. The party system is simply the distribution of parties. How many parties are there? First past the post systems tend to produce a smaller number of parties, whereas other electoral systems tend to produce a much larger number of political parties. Why is this the case? Well, it basically comes down to mathematics. In order to be certain of winning a district, you have to capture the median vote, or 50% of the vote plus one person in that particular district or area. And that means that political parties that don't have broad enough appeal to capture 50% of the vote tend to be outcompeted by parties who do. So what happens is that you end up having the formation of relatively big tent parties, which don't have a whole lot of ideological consistency, but end up being alliances of different related interests that don't always make that much sense together, but ends up being a grouping of people that can roughly get together to win 51% of the vote. So within the party, bargains are struck between, say, in the Republican Party in the United States, it's between social conservatives and economic conservatives and libertarians and Christian conservatives are all bargaining together in some ways in order to formulate some Republican platform that they can all live with, so that they can compete with a Democratic platform which involves unionists, mostly young college students, mostly unemployed, mostly African Americans, and so on and so forth. And so those different groups of people have to bargain with one another in order to come up with a platform to compete with the Republicans. But the point is that both parties are really broad groups of people that don't always see eye to eye with one another, but they're better off acting together as a party than trying to form their own splinter parties and then making sure that the other party's going to win. So the United States is a great case of Duverger's law because at the end of the day, Republicans and Democrats take the lion's share of the votes in this country. The United Kingdom is very similar to that. Admittedly, recently the Liberal Democrats have been challenging the established parties, have been getting more votes than usual, but I think most political scientists would tell you that that's anomalous, and unless the Liberal Democrats can unseat one of the major parties, Conservatives or Labor, that this recent breakthrough that they've had in elections will probably not last. Because the electoral pressures are such that if you can't reliably win districts, right? If you can't reliably win a lot of districts, in fact, not just a district, but many districts, your odds of survival are pretty low. Okay, one variation that I want to discuss on first past the post is the alternative vote, AV. Now, AV works the same as first past the post in the sense that you have single-member district systems that are usually equally sized and they have to be reapportioned from time to time. And in these districts, instead of voting for just one candidate, you basically hand in a ballot with your preferences ranked, right? So your number 1 candidate, your number 2 candidate, your number 3 candidate, your number 4 candidate. It's a little bit like MVP balloting in baseball, but not quite because the votes aren't counted the same way. But the idea is that if no candidate gets a majority of first place votes under AV, the first place votes of the candidate with the fewest first place votes are eliminated. So a candidate who finishes 10th in the running, his votes get redistributed to the second choices that all the voters who voted for that candidate made, right? So, and this process just keeps on going. You keep eliminating the least popular candidate and adding their second top choice or third top choice, or in some cases fourth top choice, until some candidate at the top has a majority. The advantage here is that alternative vote doesn't waste votes. I admit the way of counting the votes may not be completely intuitive to everyone, but the idea is simple. If you voted for an unpopular candidate, your vote will simply shift to your second preference if the unpopular candidate gets eliminated. What that does is that you don't end up costing your second or third favorite candidate the election by voting for someone who split the vote of your favorite candidates. So what this will do is that it avoids that spoiler effect that we've been talking about. And the classic spoiler effect in the United States, the example that I hope that most of you can still relate to, although I guess some of you may have been pretty young in the year 2000 when it happened, but when voters in Florida sent several thousand votes the way of Ralph Nader, instead of sending them to Al Gore, what this did was effectively probably give George Bush Jr. The presidency of the United States, because at the end of the day, if you think that those Nader voters would have preferred Gore to Bush, and I think that's a reasonable assumption, then those Nader voters ended up, by voting for Nader rather than Gore, costing Gore the election, and many Democrats are still sour about that. What we can say is that under an alternate vote system, that wouldn't have happened. Under an alternate vote system, Nader voters would have voted for Nader as their top choice, and then Gore as their second choice, and either Bush or somebody else as their third choice. And once Nader becomes the least popular candidate, he gets eliminated, and the votes for Nader automatically get transferred to Al Gore, rather than costing Gore the election. So what this does is it makes sure that you avoid these spoiler effects, right, where third parties cost the candidate that most people want to lose. Okay, so those are various types of first past the post systems. The key is that you have districts. The key is that districts are changing in sizes, so there's opportunities for gerrymandering. And the key is that you often have disproportionality in the results. because at the end of the day, what matters is not who gets the most votes, but who wins the most districts. You'll see in the video that I'm going to post by CGTP Gray that if you place your votes well, you can win a lot of districts 51-49 and lose a few districts by massive numbers of votes, and ending up winning a majority in Parliament or Congress with many fewer votes. And like I said earlier, this happened in 2012 in the United States. One of the most egregious examples, I believe, was in 1977 or 79 in the United Kingdom, where the Conservative Party, the Tory Party, won a majority of Parliament with something like 27% of the national vote. Right? They were nowhere near getting a majority of the national vote, and they still got a majority of the parliament because they placed their votes extremely well. They won a lot of narrow districts and lost others by a landslide, but they won enough districts narrowly to win the election and therefore get political power. So, like I said, starting off the lecture, how you count the votes in a democracy really matters.